So Easter Monday, the day of the Easter Rising. We talked about how it was supposed to take place on Easter Sunday. A series of unfortunate events unfolded. They thought they would have 15,000 Irish volunteers, 20,000 rifles from Germany, and a lot of ammo. All those things didn't happen. If you missed why, it's in the last video. But they're going anyway. So they march out, and they don't do a whole lot of parading and maneuvering like they were going to do with the tons of volunteers that they had, and then splinter off and start the insurrection. They go straight for the GPO, and some of the groups go off to different outposts, the palace and the railroads they were trying to get, which they didn't get, and they go straight. But the main leaders of the rising, Patrick Pearse, James Connolly, Thomas Clark, Joseph Plunkett, they all go to the GPO, and they stand with their army of about 1,200 volunteers and 200 Irish Citizens Army. Obviously not all of them, because some of them went to different outposts, but a majority of them went to the GPO, the General Post Office, which was like the headquarters of all political activity in Dublin. They stood on the steps of the GPO and they read the proclamation of the Republic of Ireland, which proclaimed that Ireland was now under a provisional government with Patrick Pearse as the president, and the 7 people on the military council as the provisional government, and proceeded to take over the GPO. And they took over the GPO, they held the GPO, and the people on the outposts, the one most notable story that I would tell is there was a man named Sean Connolly, no relation to James Connolly, who was a part of the Irish Citizens Army and was leading the brigade that went to the palace, and he drew first blood of the rising. He was in a play, I guess it should be known that he was in a play that James Connolly wrote called Under Which Flag. And when they marched out for the rising, they were marching under a few different flags. Some had the tricolor flag of Ireland, some had green flags, and the Irish Citizens Army marched under the Starry Plough, or the Plough and Stars, based on a quote I think is attributed to James Connolly. Maybe it was him that said it, but that Irish people would never be free until they controlled everything from the plough to the stars. And so they created a flag with the ploughy star, the plough and stars on it, and called it the Starry Plough. And so they marched under that banner. So it was interesting because James Connolly wrote a play basically about well, what politics are we going into this with, called Under Which Flag? And Sean Connolly was an actor who performed in that play. And also, as they marched on to as his brigade marched to the palace, he marched straight up to the constable and shot him, just point blank, and they marched into the palace. And so I often think about this when I see some altercations in the street, especially sometimes between anti-fascists and fascists, where everybody will march up and kind of square off for a long time, and then eventually brawling ensues and stuff like that. And I remember that my father once told me that if you know there's going to be a fight, if you absolutely know that that's what's going to happen, then you don't let the other person strike first. The whole letting the other person get the first punch in is BS. If you know there's going to be a fight, hit first, hit hard, and don't stop hitting until you're safe to go. And so Sean Connolly, that kind of reminded me of that. He was like, well, this is what we're here for. We're here for an insurrection, an armed insurrection. There's going to be bloodshed. There's going to be casualties. This is what we're here for. Walked straight up, shot the constable, and marched his brigade. So I thought that was an interesting story. Sometimes I wonder if that strategy could be useful in modern times. I don't want to get in too much trouble for what I say here, but at any rate, the majority of the operation was at the General Post Office, and when they took the General Post Office, they took positions in the windows with their rifles, and they were ready. They expected there was about 1,000 royal troops in town. So they did have a little bit of a numbers advantage. Unfortunately, they didn't get the railroads, so they weren't able to stop more troops from coming in, which eventually would be their downfall. The other downfall was that the British who were there were maybe less in number, but were much more heavily armed. They had much better weaponry. However, initially, when the first round of British troops, and I say British troops, but a lot of them were actually Irish enlisted in the British Army, so there's something to remember. But as the first round of British troops approached the GPO, James Connolly was trying to get everyone to hold fire until they got close enough, because his strategy was, we don't want to just scare them off. We want to get them close enough that they suffer casualties. And but some of the folks got excited. They weren't the most experienced or well trained armed force, and they started firing off. And the British did retreat, and a lot of them, were excited. Oh wow, they're retreating. We're gonna win this thing. But unfortunately, they retreated far enough back that they had cannons and heavy artillery. And the British, there's a lot that happens during the Rising. It lasted for almost 5 days, right? And so I won't get into all of the details of what happened during the battle, but basically they retreated back enough to where they could just shell the ever-loving, out of the stations that the Irish army had taken over, which is another interesting thing. Somebody said, well, how does the IRA fit into all this? I think, I'm not totally sure about this, so if somebody knows better, the IRA was not really, I think that's kind of started to be synonymous with this group of the ICA and the IRB and the volunteers that had started the insurrection, and post 1916 became a more organized group known as the IRA. But at this time, there wasn't really an IRA. That's this sort of conglomeration of people were considered the Republican Army, because that's what they were doing. They were having an insurrection to establish a Republic of Ireland. So, at any rate, the British just basically started just shelling Dublin, just all over, just massive, just bombing and shelling, and they were able to keep them basically surrounded until backup troops could come. And by the end of the week, there was thousands and thousands of British soldiers in town, and they started to move in on the different posts. At one point, the GPO was clearly under siege, and they were going to try to move people out. James Connolly caught a ricocheted bullet, and he was had a major wound in I think it was in his leg, and he couldn't, so he was on a stretcher when they tried to evacuate the GPO. And they eventually did get to some other outposts, and so the British actually suffered more casualties than the Irish army. But even more than both of those combined, Irish citizens of Dublin were being just massacred basically by the British as they came through. And this was what prompted eventually, after 5 days, for Patrick Pearse and James Connolly to decide to issue a surrender. And when they surrendered, James Connolly told people that he believed that with this surrender, everyone who signed the proclamation would likely be executed, and everyone who didn't would likely be held prisoner for a while, but eventually would be free and would be okay. So that's basically what happened. They surrendered. They took the leaders to Kilmainham jail, and over the course of the next week, they rapidly started executing the leaders of the Rising. And I think that the important thing, the reason that we remember the Rising as the beginning of the end of the British colonization of most of Ireland, is because when they first marched out the morning of the Rising, it wasn't a super popular event. The common folks, the populace, were not really super supportive of what they were doing. But when they saw the British brutality against both just the common citizenry in Dublin and then against the leaders of the rising immediately following, they shot James Connolly. They had to tie him to a chair because he couldn't stand because he was wounded when they shot James Connolly. And seeing how brutal the British government could be against their people, the tide turned. And I think we've seen this a lot. We saw this in Occupy Oakland. I don't think it was like the most popular thing going. A lot of the mainstream like liberals and progressives were not very supportive of Occupy Oakland. But then when they saw the brutality of the state, when they came out with their tanks and their tear gas and they just went to war against the folks who were staging the Occupy movement and protests, and then almost killed Scott Olson, the next event that the November 1st general strike port shutdown, there was 100,000 people or something came out for that. So I think this is a fairly common theme, and a lot of Irish sort of history they have a lot of pride in martyrdom. My daughter sometimes jokes because she says every Irish song that I listen to is either talking about glorifying dying for Ireland or drinking. So there's a lot of martyr pride in Ireland, but for good reason. I mean, what happened in 1916 was that these people thought, well, they had something that they were willing to go and die for, and then they got to witness the brutality of the state in suppressing their rebellion, and it really shifted popular opinion. And after that, the Irish Republican Army was able to become an establishment and a force, and Michael Collins was able to rally folks around the cause and stage a war for independence that ultimately would end in him signing a treaty establishing a Republic of Ireland in the 26 southern states, and then erupting in a civil war, because a lot of the people who were fighting alongside Michael Collins and with the IRA didn't think that was good enough. They needed all 32 counties united in an Irish Republic, and a great fight between those two factions broke out after, and it never really ended. And just like the colonization of Ireland there was really no point in Irish history where there wasn't some sort of rebellion, from the chieftains who fought off colonization in the first place, all the way up until, through Young Ireland in the 1800s, through the Easter Rising, and eventually through the War for Independence. There was never really a time when they didn't fight, and even since the treaty, there hasn't really been a time that Irish people have stopped fighting for full liberation for Ireland. If you grew up in the 80s like me, you know that there's still the Troubles, and there are still folks who are continuing that fight, and I think it's worth supporting. So, up the raw. It's also a little interesting with the IRA. It seems like after the civil war, after the war between factions after the treaty, the remaining folks who kept the banner of the IRA were fighting against the treaty. They were fighting for a full 32 counties united and free. So it took some interesting turns, and they're still there, and they're still fighting, and it still is happening. But that's the story, as I know it, of the pivotal moment of Easter 19